Boarding will commence shortly at gate 48. In preparation, please use the queue system provided. Have your own boarding pass and photo ID ready for inspection. As it's 5 to nearly 4, we only guarantee 90 standard cabin bag.
Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are finally going to be taking a look at the Asobo ATR 42 and 72 600 series. We are a day late, hopefully not $1 short here on the review. Unfortunately, pretty busy with work initially, and then just as I came to record I actually came down with a cold. So apologies if I am sounding a little bit croakier than usual in the video today. The ATR is a joint collaboration between Asobo and Hans Hartmann. Some of you may be familiar with Hans's previous work, namely within Microsoft Flight Simulator. I believe he also developed the Aerosoft CRJ. Anyway, the ATR retails at a very reasonable $20, even less so at the moment currently. In fact, the aircraft is on sale to premium deluxe owners of the sim. Asobo is marketing the aircraft under their Expert Series banner. The ATR is of course the first Expert Series aircraft to be released for the sim. As a result, it is going to be very interesting here to see what the product has to offer. Though tempering my expectations a little, firstly given the price and also having seen a couple of other reviews here ahead of my own. Given the price point of the ATR, I've opted to go for a review flight format here today as opposed to a full review. Nevertheless, as always, I'll aim to give you the best opportunity to see the aircraft in terms of its graphical fidelity, obviously hear its sounds, as well we'll get a good feel for the aircraft systems. As usual, we will be carrying out a full flight. We're currently on the ground at Wellington Airport, located on New Zealand's North Island. And we're going to be taking the ATR up north towards Gisborne. The flight will run all the way through from a cold and dark start, right through to the shutdown at destination. And quite a long video for you here today, as we did end up covering quite a lot along the way. It is worth mentioning from the get-go that once again we have an Asobo release that's really lacking in documentation, unfortunately. With an aircraft of this complexity, it's far from an ideal situation. So I had a bit of a dig around online. I found a checklist available for the Flight 1 ATR, for those of you who remember that. That's what we're going to be using here today, so there may be a few differences, a few discrepancies, a few user errors here on my part throughout the video. But as always, certainly we'll be covering everything in enough depth and with enough accuracy to give you a good feel of what the Asobo ATR is all about. So good morning and welcome then to a rather beautiful day here on the ground in New Zealand's capital of Wellington. On stand 79 here in the ATR, as we've discussed. I'm sure the cockpit will be very familiar to many of you at this point. There's been a prolific amount of content put out on the ATR to date. In terms of the startup process, we're going to run through things here using the Flight 1 ATR checklist. Unfortunately, once again, we have a product here that didn't really come with any documentation. So things might be slightly out of sequence from what we've seen previously, but nevertheless, it's a pretty logical sequence, and it will get the aircraft started up in a reasonable fashion. So starting with the preliminary cockpit preparation, the battery master switch can go on. So now supplying DC power to the aircraft. You'll see that momentarily the aircraft will run through some startup systems tests. So we'll just let those initialize, we'll cancel the master caution. In the meantime, continuing on with the checklist, the parking brake is set. The power levers are set to ground idle. Prop levers are set to fuel shutoff. EC is selected on, lights out, same there for the PEC. Gas lock is engaged, flaps are selected up. Landing gear lever is down 3 greens. Prop brake is selected on, and that's ready to go. Wipers are both off. Ordinarily we'd carry out an engine 2 fire test, but I find the click spots there a little bit fiddly. It's quite easy to actuate the fire handle instead, and that's going to make life pretty difficult later on. So we'll say that we've carried out an engine 2 fire test. The number 2 fuel pump can go on. And COM 1 selected on. Beacon is on in preparation for the start. Interestingly, the aircraft loads in there with the beacon on. Ordinarily the beacon of course would be off until we've got the engines running. So we're going to be starting the number 2 engine in hotel mode, which again I'm sure many of you are familiar with at this point, given the amount of content available on the ATR. Hotel mode, essentially we're running the core of the engine there, running the gas turbine, so we'll have pneumatic and electrical power coming off the number 2 engine. But the prop brake, of course, keeping the prop in place, so safe for any ground crew, whilst we're running the engine, essentially using it as an APU. So for the number 2 start, we'll bring the start selector through to A and B for the first start of the day, and engage the number 2 starter. Keeping an eye here on the NH, we're looking till we're up through 10%, just coming through 10% now. So we can bring the number 2 condition lever through to the feather position, introducing fuel into the engine. Again, cancelling the master caution, you can see there the oil pressure coming up, and the ITT there as well. Just waiting there for the engine to stabilise.
Qantas 7524, descend to 6000.
So we do have a good start there on the number 2. We'll take the number 2 generator on. So DC Gen 2 on, same there for DC Gen 1. Obviously seeing a fault light there at the moment with the engine not running. So we have established electrical power for the fuel quantity. We've got 1,100 kilos there in each main tank, so 2,200 total on board, which concurs with the flight plan. Annunciator lights, we'll test those. Just having a good scan around the cockpit. Overall, I don't find the lighting particularly spectacular in the aircraft, I have to say. So lights are checked, we'll go back to bright for daytime conditions. For the bleeds, again expecting to see a fault there on engine number 1. Cross bleed valve is open. Pretty hot down the back there at the moment, 33 degrees. We'll leave the temperature selectors where they are, hopefully things will start cooling off now we've got some air going down the back. And checking the avionics vent, that is set to auto. Moving on to the cockpit preparation checklist, internal lighting set as required. Fuel pump number 1 is set to run. Doors, we have both the cabin and the cargo door unlocked currently. And just testing the door switch. Spoilers, we're looking for lights out. Landing gear again, confirming down 3 greens. MFCs, again no lights. TLU set to auto. And again, we should carry out an engine 1 fire test, but we'll hold off on doing that again for the same issues as with the number 1. External lighting for now, just the beacon and the nav lights, that's set as required. Emergency exit lights can go to arm, and we'll get the passenger signs on, aircraft already fueled up. Anti-ice and de-ice. Again, we're just looking for lights out currently, which we have. Probes. And windshield heats can go on. And again, just looking for no white lights. The AC wild electrical power will take both generators on there, showing fault lights currently. We won't have any AC wild power until we move the prop levers through to the auto position. Hydraulic power again, turning all of the hydraulic pumps on, and again just looking for no white lights. Low pressure currently, of course, with the engines not running. The emergency locator transmitter is set to auto and guarded. Cabin and cockpit temperature selectors, again we'll leave those as is. Cabin temperature just starting to come down. Oxygen main supply is selected on, and we'll carry out a compartment smoke test. And again, just cancelling that master caution. The trims, they're set to neutral. We are though just going to put in a little bit of aileron trim here. I find about 1 unit right aileron trim tends to have the aircraft flying a little bit more stably overall. So aileron trim is set. We'll set the elevator trim later on once we've calculated our takeoff performance. Radios. VHF radios we're not going to need for the flight today. As far as our nav radios go as well, it's going to be an RNAV departure, so we won't need to tune anything up initially for the departure. In terms of TCAS, we'll set the traffic to above for now. And transponder currently set to standby, squawking 7000. The radios are set, transponder is set, idle gate is selected. Emergency audio cancel, a little bit tricky to see here, that's hidden just behind the number 1 condition lever, that is guarded. Radar can go through to standby. The EADI and EHSI, they are of course both selected on. And for the source there we've got FM1 there on both sides. Standby instruments are checked, no flags. Power management is set to take off. Engine instruments are checked. Engine controls are checked, we've got no white lights there. We'll carry out a stick pusher, stick shaker test. Coming down to the left-hand maintenance panel, there's actually a variety of tests that we can carry out here, but we'll just go for the stick push today, just to demonstrate. So you can see there, the stick shaker, the stick pusher is modelled. And again, just closing up that maintenance panel. Anti-skid is selected on, lights out. So that's the preliminary cockpit preparation setup complete, and we are now ready to move down towards the FMS, and we can set that up for our departure. So down at the MCDU, we'll select FMS 1. Pretty easy to set up the aircraft overall. There are a few bugs. We'll talk through those as we go. So firstly, onto init, and we'll go to POSINIT, just aligning off the GPS position, and we can initialize there our sensors. We'll hit return. Onto the nav data. Not sure whether or not this is actually correct or accurate, but it seems as though the nav database is quite out of date, which is a bit of a shame for a new product. Then next down to the flight plan init, we'll go to route. Departing, as we said, from Wellington, which is November, Zulu, Whiskey, November. And we're going to be flying the aircraft up towards Gisborne today, which is November, Zulu, Golf, Sierra. Flight number is Air New Zealand, so Alpha November Zulu 8282. And we can execute that. Very much Airbus style in terms of setting up the departure, which is nice. So going to Wellington, going to be departing off runway 16. It's going to be the UPROG 1 Quebec departure, and that'll be out via waypoint Camet. Once again, we can hit execute. So we'll just build up the rest of the route manually here. Definitely one of the bugs I found with the unit currently is it doesn't seem to accept airways. It tends to freeze up the MCDU, and after which point you can't use it any longer, so definitely a little bit of a bug there currently. Anyway, for our route today, from Kemet we're going to be tracking out towards Binit, which is Bravo, India, November, India, Tango. After waypoint Binit, it'll be Papa Mike. Then on towards waypoint Yarrow, which is Yankee, Alpha, Romeo, Romeo, Oscar. From Yarrow, be the November Romeo. So for November Romeo, you can see we've got three options there. Of course, we want the New Zealand nav database, South 39, so we'll select that. From November Romeo, it's going to be waypoint Domon, Delta, Oscar, Mike, Oscar, November. And again, we want Sierra 39. And lastly, waypoint Gotno, Golf, Oscar, Tango, November, Oscar. And that'll take us on to the arrival. So once again, we'll hit execute. And again, selecting Gisborne. We'll fly the RNAV 32. We're probably going to make primarily a visual approach into Gisborne, but we'll use the RNAV just for guidance initially. We're going to be coming in via the Hawk 2 Bravo arrival, and that'll be via waypoint Uclip. And that's the FMS flight plan set up. We should have a discontinuity in there, so we'll just clear that up.
Call it 7524, cancel style, continue present heading.
And hitting execute once again. And we'll just briefly run our way through the flight plan. Out towards Camet off the departure. Through towards Gotno. And then joining the Hawk 2 Bravo arrival for the RNAV runway 32. As you can see, pretty easy to set up the flight plan overall with the aircraft. Indeed, the FMS in general, quite easy to set up. Again, just minus those bugs that we've already mentioned. So flight plan set. Next we want to enter the aircraft weights. Zero fuel weight for the flight today is 20,282 kilos. So 20282. And fuel on board, as we discussed, is 2,200 kilos. Or 2216 to be more precise. That's giving us a gross weight of 22,500 kilograms, so just below max takeoff weight. Reserve for our flight today is 677 kilos. That's including our diversion fuel, so that's our diversion plus 30 minutes. Alternate today is going to be Rotorua. We'll enter that in just a moment's time. Takeoff CFG 29.6, that's giving us a takeoff stab trim of 0.8 up. For the Perfinite, cruise flight level is going to be flight level 190. We do want max cruise as the mode, default flight path angle 3 degrees. Ultimate again, as we said, Rotorua, so November, Zulu, Romeo, Oscar. And cruise flight level over to our alternate is going to be flight level 170.
Japan F51, keep speed 180 knots until you have passed 7 miles.
So the Perfinite now complete, we have our takeoff speeds. As you can see, once again, Wellington runway 16. Transition altitude is 13,000 feet. And for the takeoff speeds, we have V1 112, VR 112, and V2 115. We can set those up later on to display on the PFD. So the FMS setup is complete. We'll just brief the departure. Again, it's going to be the UPROG 1 Quebec departure off runway 16. It's an RNAV departure, so again, no nav aids associated with the departure itself. It's going to have us initially tracking out towards the south, towards waypoint Urban. We've got a max restriction there of 200 knots until the turn is complete. That's fine for us today. We're going to be climbing at a speed of 170 knots, and that does comply with the ATC speed requirements of maximum of 170 knots, minimum 150 towards waypoint Agror. We do have some pretty significant high terrain out towards the east and the northeast of the field. So MSA for the departure, 6,600. There's no stop heights on the departure, we just need to be above 5,000 before we commence the turn. So we'll set flight level 190 later on for the level off altitude. Weather-wise, it's a beautiful day here, not really much to say with regards to the weather. Lastly, in terms of the taxi, we're currently on stand 79 as we discussed. No need for a push today, so we're just going to get the aircraft started. We'll come off right onto Quebec, then Bravo, we'll take Bravo 6 most likely, and then onto Alpha, taxiing down for the holding point Alpha 2, take a slight intersection departure this morning. Anyway, that's our preliminary cockpit setup complete. Hopefully things are starting to cool down the back, and we'll get the passengers boarded fairly shortly. As usual, we'll take a quick wander through the cabin there, get a feel for the level of modelling detail, and we can come back to the flight deck once we've finished up the last of our preparations and we are ready for the start.
Aircraft 2 here forward of row 1 and 2 window exits in row 10. In the event of an emergency, floor lighting will guide you to these exits. The safety on board card also illustrates the location and operation of your life jacket. Infant life jackets will be provided by the crew. Civil aviation rules require you to comply with all crew instructions and signs while on board our aircraft. And just one last final reminder, all transmitting devices must now be in the flight mode option.
Okay, so we've just finished the last of our preparations. Everybody's now on board the aircraft. We've got the doors closed up. Whilst you're gone, just running through a final few items, so making sure we've got the destination airport elevation set. It's an automatic system on the 600 ATR series. It takes data directly from the FMS, I believe, for the aerodrome elevation. Altimeters are set, speed bugs are set. We've got auto there on the speed selection. Torque bugs and trims, so we just need to set the elevator trim, and again we said up 0.8 units. I would question that trim setting though. We'll talk through the takeoff later on, but the aircraft essentially seems to auto-rotate during the takeoff at the moment, which is very unusual. So torque bugs and trims are set. ComNav, ADF and transponder are set. Fuel quantity, once again just checking, we have 1,100 kilos there in each main tank. Seats and pedals are secure. Doors are closed. And we have some checklists to work our way through here. Really nice on the aircraft, we have the checklists modelled as part of the CCAS system. There are push buttons down here, but obviously that's a little bit tricky trying to use the push buttons and look at the screen at the same time. So one nice concession we have here, there are actually some click spots provided on the CCAS, which we can use to work our way through. I'm not entirely sure whether this counts as part of the CCAS or whether it's just the left-hand section, but we'll just refer to it as the CCAS for the flight today. So actuating the final cockpit preparation checklist. Parking brake is set. We're not going to work our way around checking everything here just for the sake of the video, otherwise we're going to be back and forth to the screen quite a bit, but we know already we've got the park brake set. Altimeters have been checked and set. Landing elevation is checked. FMS com and nav radios are set. Fuel quantity, once again 2,200 kilograms of fuel on board. Fuel used, no need to reset there, first flight of the day. Nice as well, you'll notice the screens actually produce automatically the page you're looking for, as per the checklist. Memo panel, so we've got ELEC, AC wild 1 and 2, hydraulic system loss, air bleed 1, various anti-icing, hydraulic blue low pressure, hydraulic green low pressure, expecting to see all of those at the moment. And power management once again is set to take off. So that's the final cockpit preparation checklist complete. And now moving on to the before propeller rotation checklist. So CDLS is on, FMS and takeoff data is once again confirmed, V1 112, VR 112, V2 115. Trims, rudder trim neutral, aileron trim should be neutral, but again we've discussed that already, just a little bit of right aileron trim, and 0.8 up there on the elevator trim. Tail prop has been removed, doors are once again checked closed, seatbelt signs are on, and the beacon is on. That's the before propeller rotation checklist complete. So once again, just confirming the beacon is on, and we are now cleared for the start. So just a couple more items to run through. Prop brake can come off. And as the prop brake comes off, we should start to see the NP increase. We're just waiting until we see that come through 10%, which we already have, up through 16%. So we can now move the number 2 condition lever into the auto position. As the prop runs up, we should also now receive AC wild electrical power there off the AC Gen 2. And you can see that just kicking in. So it looks like we do have a good start there on the number 2. We can do the same for engine 1. The start selector once again set through to start A and B, fuel pump set to run, and we'll engage the number 1 starter. So NH coming up again, looking for 10% NH. There's 10%. And the prop lever coming through to the feather detent. And once again on the MP, just waiting until we see 10%, and then we'll move the condition lever through to the auto position.
Qantas 7524, start reducing speed 220 knots.
There we have our 10%. So number 1 in auto. And once more, we'll just wait for the engine to stabilise.
Cathay 111, turn right, heading 150 base.
Right, heading 150, Cathay 111.
And looks like we do have 2 good starts. So for the AC wild electrical systems, both generators now online, hydraulic power looks good. Flaps we can set through to the takeoff position, so 15 degrees. And we'll just wait here until we have flaps 15 indicated. So flaps are set for takeoff. Once again, the anti-skid is on. Butt brake can come off. We'll just hold the aircraft here on the brakes momentarily. In preparation for the taxi, we'll get the taxi light on there as well. External lights are set. Parking brake is released. We'll scan the instruments on the way out. Just running through a few more checks here before we commence the taxi. So once again, bleeds are set. The cabin temperature now looking much more reasonable, as you can see, around 21 degrees. AC wild power is checked. Cockpit comm hatch is checked closed. We actually have a nice little hatch here. You can use that to transfer documents on the ground, since there's no sliding windows here on the ATR. For the autopilot, assigned altitude, again we have flight level 190 selected and indicated there on the PFD. For the departure we have heading select in low with LNAV armed. For the speed we have V2 plus 5, so 120 knots versus 115 there for V2. And for CPL, which I presume stands for couple, we have the autopilot there coupled to the left hand side. Flight director bars are both on. And for the EFIS panel, we'll select navigation display. And we'll just come through to the full display. A little bit fiddly there to get the click spot. So the nav display is set. And lastly, just carrying out a takeoff config test. So config is checked, and we'll carry out the before taxi checklist. So before taxi, flight warning system, we'll hit recall. Nothing displayed there. Cockpit comm hatch is checked closed. Condition levers are both set to auto. Anti-ice not required. TRU is selected on and guarded. Anti-skid test will carry out on the taxi. And for flaps, 15 selected and indicated. Nose wheel steering is selected on. And that is the before taxi checklist complete. So we are now ready for the taxi. As discussed, we'll hang a right here onto Quebec. And then joining Bravo, crossing onto Alpha, and taking the holding point out for Alpha 2. Overall, the ATR actually taxis rather nicely. I've never flown a turboprop, so I don't know whether they ordinarily taxi under idle power, but certainly the ATR will here in the sim. That's pretty typical of any jet at reasonable weights. You can usually taxi under idle power. That's nice to see in the sim. A lot of aircraft don't tend to get that right. Currently, as you can see, we've got the power levers there all the way back and picking up a nice speed. Also nice that the aircraft doesn't run away from you. It taxis at a very reasonable pace. So looking out towards the south, again a beautiful day here in Wellington. Nice and clear on our departure track. Does feel sitting quite close to the ground here as though we're taxiing rather fast. We're only doing 9 knots, which is perfectly acceptable for a turn. But it feels much faster than that, as I say. So onto Bravo, left here onto Alpha, so it'll be left and then right. We'll just wait until we've got ourselves onto Alpha. Then we can carry out our before takeoff checks.
Cathay 111, continue descent to 3000.
Descent 3000, Cathay 111.
So overall I actually really like how the ATR taxis. I think that's one of the product's strengths. We are all clear on the left. Obviously though you don't generally purchase a product for its taxiing capabilities alone, but it's nice to see nevertheless.
On a 7524, descent to 5000. 5000.
Okay, so taxiing now down Alpha, as I say, holding point Alpha 2 for the departure today. So for the before takeoff checks, the gust lock, just make sure we've got ourselves nice and straight here before we carry out the checks. Gust lock is released, flight controls, we have full up, full down, and neutral, full left, full right, and neutral. We're not going to check the rudder here as I'm using that as well to actuate the nose wheel steering. Takeoff clearance has been obtained, so lights, strobe lights can go on, same there as well for the landing lights. The CCAS will hit recall, and once again nothing pertinent for us there. Transponder, onto the surveillance page, we'll set the transponder through to the on position. And TCAS once again is set to above here for the climb. Radar will come through to weather, not anticipating that we're obviously going to need that today, with the conditions such that they are. But displaying weather nevertheless there on the nav display. Slightly uphill, so we'll just come up on the power to avoid losing too much speed here in the taxi. One thing I did notice, I forgot to mention that earlier on, it does seem as though even with the gust lock engaged you can actually bring up the power levers to quite a high power setting. I'm not sure that that's probably accurate. Anyway, continuing on with the checks, both engine prop levers are set to the auto position. So we'll just continue down the taxiway here, out for holding point Alpha 2. Just a couple more items, one more checklist to run, and then we'll be ready for the departure.
6478, 6470. Approach good, velocity 410.0, receive.
78 approach, descend by 1000, runway 16 right, let's approach, mainland approach provision.
Body star 676 right, velocity 47. Approach, good afternoon, 36, clear the runway, bye-bye.
Heading 436, approach by star to west, runway 16 right, approach, and independent provision.
We're ready to and runway 1, killing 436.
Right, so we are now lined up here on runway 16, just completed the before takeoff checks. I find the easiest way here to work through the takeoff is to just come up through to the notch power setting with the aircraft on the brakes. It can be a little bit fiddly to get the throttles into the detent. That being said, the detent can be adjusted. We'll talk more about that as we make the climb, but for now, anyway, as I say, holding the aircraft on the brakes, just bring up the power levers. So throttles are in notch, and takeoff. Off the brakes. Keeping an eye there on our engine power settings. The aircraft is pretty sensitive on the rudder initially. Power is set. And we'll have to put in quite a bit of forward pressure here as well on the yoke. That's not unusual, it's the same on the Airbus initially, just coming up through 70 knots. However, as I discussed there on the ground, the aircraft will actually auto-rotate without any forward pressure, which is very strange. And interestingly, this CRJ did the same thing, which I believe was made by the same developer. NZWN rotate. They're back on the yoke. Again, very little input there from me. The aircraft wanting to bring the nose wheel up of its own accord. So we have LNAV climbing in IS, so following the flight directors, positive climb, gear up. Wait until we're up through 1,000 feet, which we now are, so we'll come through to the climb power setting. And as we do so there, the speed automatically increasing to 170 knots for the climb. Just wait until through F speed and then we can retract the flaps, so pitching the nose down. And the flight director is now commanding our turnout to the left. Through F speed, so the flaps can come up.
Approach Japan 51, establish final runway 25.
Japan 51, thanks.
And we'll just hand fly the aircraft for a short period of time here to get a little bit more of a feel for its handling. Overall, I'm a little bit on the fence about the ATR's flight model. It's a pleasant enough aircraft to fly. It's actually very easy to fly. You can see the flight directors here working very well. It's pretty stable overall, especially once you've got that aileron trim in. With that being said, the flight model feels fairly lightweight in terms of how the aircraft actually responds. The control response is pretty instantaneous. Again, very stable, hands off the controls now, you can see sitting on the flight directors, and the flight directors working very well there. They are actually giving us the commanded speed. Anyway, we'll center up our heading bug once again. We can engage the yaw damper and the autopilot. I have noticed the aircraft tends to overshoot the turn here, but that might be a coding error. You can see a little bit strange in terms of how the departure is coded there. So just to give us a little bit of a helping hand, we'll go direct to waypoint Agraw.
7524, you can expect a base turn in 1 minute.
Doesn't seem to have helped the situation much. Just wait until we come up through 5,000 feet to make that turn. That's coded in the box. So it's actually correct there that the aircraft hasn't made the turn just yet. Come out on the range on the nav display. We'll just make the turn a little bit early here again, just to help the aircraft out. We're visually clear, of course, today with the terrain. So we'll come into heading.
Japan 51, 8 miles to run, number 1. Contact the tower, 120, decimal 5.
Yeah, 105, Japan 51.
And once we've got ourselves nicely established outbound, we'll run through the after takeoff checks. Slightly hazy early morning conditions here as we make our way off the coastline here of Wellington. Just leaving the airport behind.
Cathay 111, turn right, heading 210 to join final approach course runway 25, cleared the GLS approach.
And again, we'll just wait until we're up through 5,000 before we turn back in towards the terrain.
Right, heading 210, cleared GLS approach 25, Cathay 111.
So just coming up on 5,000. And we'll go direct to waypoint Adlac. And back into nav. Once again we have LNAV there on the FMA. One thing that does prove quite nicely, the aircraft will accept direct 2s. Overall I found, with the exception of the bugs that we mentioned already, with the MCDU or the FMS, it seems to work pretty well actually. The units as well though do seem to be somewhat independent. They do cross-talk. You will notice that we do have some of the information entered in there, but for example, go to flight plan. Slightly strange in terms of the display, and I found that certain things don't switch across. There's a little bit of an error again, I think, there with the MCDU. Anyway, running through the after takeoff checks. Autopilot is set on. External lights, we'll take the taxi lights off. Engine power management is set to climb. Transition altitude is 13,000, so we can hold off there for now. And actioning the after takeoff checklist, landing gear is selected up, lights out. Flaps are up. Power management once again is set to climb. Engine bleeds are selected on. And just holding there at the takeoff lights until we come up through 10,000 feet.
United 839, descend to 4,000.
So just coming up on 7,000, once again we'll centre up the heading bug.
Descend to 4,000, United 839.
As with the FMS, overall the autopilot actually seems to do a pretty nice job. We'll obviously get more of a feel for that during the arrival as well, but having used VNAV, that seemed to fly the profile pretty nicely. The other attempts I've made to fly the approach into Gisborne. And everything seems to work quite correctly in terms of managed speed. Again, we're holding 170 knots. The flight directors there are accurate. The aircraft will maintain speed very nicely for us. So again, a real mixed bag overall with the aircraft. I do find that some things work quite well on the ATR, but overall it just doesn't give me that quote-unquote study level feel. I think to call it an expert series, probably a little bit generous. Anyway, as we continue the climb here, another 2,000 feet till we get the landing lights off, we'll just run through a couple of items. Firstly, we'll just briefly work our way through the EFB. Although perhaps more importantly, before we do that, we might as well enjoy a little bit of the scenery. So Wellington passing off the left wing, you might just about be able to make out the airport there as well. Bit of an interesting route today. We actually crisscrossed the Northern Ireland a couple of times. Firstly, tracking out towards the west coast and then crossing back over towards the eastern coast.
7524, descend to 3,000.
So as far as the EFB goes, firstly we have a payload manager, which on the face of it looks quite nice, but actually I find the functionality here is a little bit backwards. Rather than the weights here being displayed so that we can then input the data on the MCDU, in fact you have to enter the data on the MCDU to be displayed here on the payload manager. Also, as far as I can tell, no option to set up the weight and balance of the aircraft via the menu as opposed to using the Sim's inbuilt menu, so that's a little bit odd and I would like to see that functionality changed around. Really you want to have the figures available here to enter into the FMS. That's much more typical for most add-ons. As well, you can see we have a series of operating speeds. Nice to have there in case they're not readily to hand otherwise. So for example, during the arrival, later on we'll be able to take first stage of flaps below 185 knots, gear below 170, and the second stage of flap below 150. In the performance we have the takeoff data calculated automatically, so V1 was 112, same for VR, and V2 115, as we saw there in the FMS. We also have a landing data calculator, which is nice. We'll definitely be using reverse later on into Gisborne. It's a pretty short runway. Anticipating dry conditions. The required runway length there is 2268 at our current weight. And again, a fairly short runway, we've got 4,300 feet available. Our V approach later on is going to be, again, 112 knots. Just coming up through 10,000, so we'll get the landing lights off. And seatbelt signs can go off there as well. So just actioning the next item on our checklist, and we're now waiting for 13,000 feet to set the altimeters. In terms of the aircraft options, seen some of those already. We have a ground power unit option. No visible model there as far as I'm aware, just the option to have ground power selected through the cockpit controls. We can open the cargo door, same for the main door. We can install the tail prop on the ATR 72. Wheel chocks we can install as well, and lastly we can open up the service door. There are state options. We have cold and dark, external power, hotel mode, which we've discussed, and ready for taxi. I did briefly try the ready for taxi option. That didn't actually seem to get us into a ready for taxi state. The engines still weren't running, so maybe just a few tweaks needed there as well. Maintenance again looks very similar to the CRJ, so we have the option to refill both the engine and fire bottles, and same there for the oxygen supply, and we can reset the brake temperature. Again, as far as I'm aware, no real failures modelled on the aircraft, so not really sure why you'd need the engine fire bottles, but nevertheless, I suppose it's nice to have some basic maintenance functionality. And lastly, in terms of aircraft options, we can choose between hectopascals and inches of mercury for the altimeters, and choose whether or not as well the altimeters sync across the board. Temperature units, Celsius or Fahrenheit, same for weight, we can have kilograms or pounds. You can choose at what sensitivity the autopilot disconnects. Just come up through 12,500 feet there, so another 500 feet will set the altimeters. Avionics mode I haven't played around with there, but you can choose between EASA and FAA. I wonder if that relates to buffet margin, I'm not entirely sure. PFD throttle hint, you may have noticed that during the takeoff, we can choose to have a throttle position hint display there. So I don't believe that's accurate to the aircraft, but it's nice to have, saves you looking down to see what detent your throttles are in. There's 13,000 feet, we'll set the altimeters to standard.
All stations, the information Quebec is now current. The wind 2308 knots, QNH 1023.
Interestingly, 1012 there on the standby. And standard there on the right as well. That's interesting, despite having them set to sync, it doesn't seem as though they actually did sync. Again, just coming out on the range here on the nav display. And once again, just centering up our heading bug. Yeah, so the throttle hint I think is a nice feature. Obviously you don't have as much tactile feedback with typical sim hardware as you would with the real aircraft. You can choose the limits at which the autopilot disconnects, also the TORS resolution, I'm not entirely sure what that refers to. Throttle setup is worth going through before you fly the aircraft. I've seen some people mentioning they've had issues with the throttles. Personally, so far I haven't had any issues with the aircraft throttles, and I did configure those ahead of time. Lastly, as mentioned already, the aircraft does have some click spots available on the various MFDs. You can just complete the after takeoff checklist there as well. So checklist complete, just coming up through flight level 140, another 5,000 feet here in the climb. As a quick reference here, you have all of the various click spots displayed for the various PFDs. Generally I find I only use the CCAS display click spots, the rest are not too difficult to use in a more typical fashion. So that pretty much outlines the EFB functionality. Not bad overall, fairly basic, but nevertheless, I'd say just above average in terms of what's available. Anyway, just coming up through flight level 150, so another 4,000 feet here in the climb. Again, we've got the seatbelts off. Despite it being a fairly short hop for us here today, the ATR is by no means the quickest aircraft in the world, so we're going to be in the cruise here for around 30 minutes overall. As usual, we'll just briefly head outside the aircraft, take a little bit of a closer look at the external model in flight. And I think what we'll do here for the arrival, we'll come back just at the top of the descent, we'll get the aircraft coming down, then we can get everything set up, brief the arrival, and if we've got any extra time there, we'll just cover off a few items, for example, in terms of what I think of the aircraft sounds, and the overall graphical fidelity.
Today, velocity 841, 0,000 information.
Velocity 841, stand by 1, right brake 38 and left heading 30.
Heading 360, corner 7.
Velocity 80 and by status runway 16 right, expect approach, then independent division.
Star 6000, copy 1, velocity 841. Approach X-ray, let's passing 6,600, flight level 140.
X-ray, Lima Victor approach, time initially 9,000 feet.
We can be on descent by 9, X-ray Lima Victor.
X-ray Lima Victor, approach to climb to flight level 110, stand by for the onward.
140, X-ray left.
Got us to the left heading 340.
Heading 340, 38, approaching 6000.
38, stand by. Victor, that by traffic now 3,000 knots, currently to the east of Wilton, still tracted. Flight is 990 from 0,000, QNH 10.
10,000, 994. Victor, shoots an aircraft out.
Thank you. Identification terminated.
Victor.
Flight 994, continue descent to 6,000, 6 right. I can give you some track shortening if you want.
6,000 and ASO plus 994. From 010 heading and away from the 9,000 block.
Flight 994 in the hot climate Tammy and best stay till 6,000.
stay till 6,000, cancel requirement, how many corners flight on you?
Getting 410, descend 6,000, runway 16 direct approach, independent approach on visual. Cement at 9,000 or below bonding.
To 6,000 feet. Feet by runway 1614.
So welcome back to the flight deck of the ATR. As discussed, we're just approaching our top of descent point. Just to keep the math simple, we're up at roughly flight level 200, which means we need around 60 miles to complete the descent here. As you can see, showing 64 miles to run. So overall the aircraft's done quite a nice job there of calculating our top of descent point. Initially we're going to descend down to 2,000 feet, we'll discuss that more once we brief up the arrival. But we'll pre-select that here on the MCP.
United 863, descend to 6,000.
Descend 6,000, United 863.
One thing I don't really like about the aircraft displays, they're actually quite hard to read, you'll probably have noticed that during the video. Anyways, flight level 20 set. And just coming up on top of descent, you can see we do have our VNAV path. So we'll engage VNAV. We have VNAV out star. Be interesting to see how the aircraft behaves there. I did actually find earlier on I levelled off just below, or as you can see, just above flight level 190. I tried to finesse it with VS, that didn't work. And thereafter we were stuck in out star. Okay, it does look as though it's working correctly, so we have VNAV path. Obviously there's the speed starting to increase, so bringing the power levers back.
Delta 41, descend to 3,000, and you are cleared the ILS approach, runway 25.
And the managed speed there wants to drive us right up to around 245 knots. We'll stay a little bit below that just to give us some margin. That way we're not going to be fixated on the speed here as we continue around with the setup. We'll just come in on the range again on the nav display. You can see I've selected the terrain display here as well. Obviously no weather around, so not much point having the weather radar up. Whereas there's some fairly high terrain going in towards Gisborne. Anyway, we'll set the aircraft up for the arrival first. We can brief thereafter. They're expecting the Hooks 2 Bravo on our arrival, and then flying the RMP for runway 32. Again, we're not specifically going to be flying the RMP approach here, we're just going to be using it for the purposes of navigation, just to bring us around onto runway heading. We'll mostly be flying a visual approach here today. So first setting up the MDA, we're looking at an MDA of 440.
United 863, cancel start, turn left heading 125.
Left turn 125, United 863.
We have 440 selected there for the MDA. Again, just coming slightly further back on the power levers. One thing I have noticed, there isn't a lot of finesse between idle and low power setting. You can see there at idle, the speed really coming back. But if we even just nudge the throttles up 1 millimetre more, we're pretty much maintaining speed. That seems a little bit unlikely. Perhaps that's some sort of mode on the aircraft, or perhaps it's modelling the prop disking, I'm not really sure there, but anyway, you don't have much finesse with the speed there, as I say. Just coming down through flight level 160, you can see maintaining nicely here our VNAV path, and overall that does seem to work pretty well on the aircraft. In terms of our performance for the landing, once again, planning on full reverse, dry runway. We now require 2,234 feet, 4,300 available at Gisborne. Coming onto the performance page. For the approach, transition altitude or transition level is 15,000 feet, QNH 1007 this morning. The wind auto-populated by the sim. And the approach 112, it's going to be a flaps full landing. Just come back onto the progress page for now. They're just coming through flight level 150, that means we need around 45 miles to run, and still looking good there at the moment. It's pretty easy to get the ATR slowed down nice and quickly, so you don't need to be particularly conservative with your approaches. You can really gun the aircraft in and slow down at the last minute. Lastly, we just set up the VOR approach, not that we're planning on flying it, but we'll have it as backup. So if we come on to nav, we've already got the Gisborne VOR there tuned up in the standby, so we'll switch that across to the active. 1142, showing about 37 miles to run direct to the field. And similarly as well, the course selector on VOR 1, we've got that selected for the runway heading. That's pretty much it in terms of the setup for now. We'll brief the approach. So once again, we're expecting the Hooks 2 Bravo on our arrival. That's plate 10-2 Alpha. Not much to say there really. Again, it is an RNAV star. Aerodrome elevation off the chart, 15 feet. That's going to bring us in from the west. And then we'll track back out towards the north once we join onto the RMP. The RMP, final approach course 323. Again, aerodrome elevation 15 feet. Starting the approach at 2,000 feet, hence why we've selected 2,000 for now by the MCP. We'll be descending later on down to the MDA of 440. I'm not entirely sure how it's done in the ATR. I have seen in the Asobo series there, you can actually select the MDA as your pre-selected altitude, so we'll do that here today. A little bit different from the Airbus. Anyway, for the missed approach, it's max of 210 knots. That's obviously going to be fine for us. Left turn out towards Kopua, and then holding at 2,700 feet. In terms of the terrain, there is pretty high terrain around Gisborne, both out towards the west and the north. We've got terrain out to the west up to around 2,500 feet, and the MSA out towards the north, 6,200. Weather much the same as we saw out of Wellington, a really nice day. Visibility's actually cleared up a little bit, so that should help us in terms of spotting the runway later on. In terms of the runway, again landing runway 32. It's a pretty short runway, so again full reverse, manual braking, and we'll have to backtrack the runway later on to vacate. As we discussed on the ground in Wellington, Rotorua is the alternate today. We need 677 kilos for the diversion. Currently showing landing with around 1,400 kilos on board. And in terms of what the aircraft currently has on board, 1,500, so that seems like a reasonable figure. Overall, I did plan an extra 30 minutes as well. Of course, not having flown the ATR much, not knowing how accurate the fuel burn is. Overall, that fuel for the arrival looks pretty reasonable.
United 863, AFM 6,000.
Anyway, that's the briefing complete, just coming down through 10,000, so we'll get the belts on once again. And the landing lights can go on. We'll run through our descent checks. So for the descent checklist, again just coming back into idle briefly here on the power, just to give us some speed margin. The CCAS, once again we'll hit recall. No pertinent items for us there. Seatbelt signs have been turned on. Descent clearance we have. Autopilot in VNAV path, landing lights are on below 10, and we are now below transition. So once again we can set 1007 on all three altimeters. Now I'm running through the descent checklist. Flight warning system has been recalled, landing elevation is checked. FMS nav and performance pages have been set and checked. The MDA again 440, and the arrival briefing is complete, and that is the descent checklist complete. So once again we're just going to be tracking out towards the northeast, inbound towards waypoint Kapua. We'll get the aircraft slowed down about 5 miles before Kapua, just to help make the turn. We'll keep ourselves coming down now in VNAV at 2,000 feet, and as we approach Kapua we'll set 500 feet, continue the descent in VNAV. Once we're visual with the runway, we can disconnect and we'll fly a manual visual approach.
Actually, close to me.
Should have velocity 410, 10,000, receive.
79 approach below, descend 1,000, runway 16 right, let's approach, then end approach provision.
Somebody star 676 right, velocity 47. Approach, good afternoon, 36, clear to 9 mate, bye-bye.
So just approaching waypoint Kapua, you can see there the bay in which Gisborne's located, with the runway somewhere out at 10 o'clock. Just approaching 5 miles, so we'll start coming back to idle now on the power, start reducing that speed. The speed should automatically switch into the approach mode, but if needed we can always come to the perf page and activate that manually. We'll just leave things for now, see what the aircraft does. Showing about 16 miles to run, 5,000 feet, so still in good here in terms of the profile. And happy there we're going to make 2,000 above at Kapua, so we'll set 500. And that will have us levelling off just above the MDA. We'll come all the way back to idle now on the power levers. We'll aim to have the speed back around 180 knots here for the turn. In terms of the approach check, seatbelts are on, landing lights are on, altimeters are set and checked, cabin altitude is set, and that's the approach checklist complete. So you can see the speed bug there has automatically come back to 170 knots. So we'll maintain that for now. 280, we can take the first stage of flaps.
United 863, turn right, heading 140 base.
140, United 863.
And we are below 180, so we'll just take one stage of flap for now, flaps 15. Just to give us a little bit more drag, help reduce that speed further. We'll come back to around 160. We should make the turn quite nicely now as a result. And you can see 3,500 feet just making the turn over Kapua. So we're fine there in terms of our altitude restriction. We'll slew the heading bug around just to save us one less thing to do later on.
210, final approach, course clear, GLS 25 and 863.
And below 170 knots we can take the gear down. We'll just hold off on that for now. I'm sure by turboprop standards this is a pretty conservative approach. Again, you can keep the speed up. Quite a bit of drag on the aircraft it seems, so you can get slowed down nice and quickly. They're really flying the aircraft a little bit more like a jet here, but force of habit. Not visual with the runway just yet, we'll keep a good eye out for that. The aircraft is slightly undershot the turn here, you can see we're just coming back onto track now. And again, quite difficult to read these screens, just coming through 8 miles. So 8 miles, we'll take the gear down. And again, just maintaining 160 knots for now, so coming back up on the power levers. The before landing checks, cabin crew have been advised, landing gear. Just holding off there for 3 greens, we have down 3 greens, flaps. Currently 15, so we'll just hold the checklist for now. The aircraft is quite nice in terms of speed stability, easy to control the speed with the power levers, which is great for this sort of aircraft. Makes it much more enjoyable to fly. Just coming down through 2,000, 6 miles, so profile's still looking good. And again, we've tracked the VNAV path very nicely all the way down the approach here. Visual now with the runway. The aircraft, I have noticed, does have a slight hiccup. You can see we're switching between VNAV path and another vertical mode there, I'm not entirely sure what. We've got VNAV out star. That's, I think, to meet the restriction here at waypoint Vesav. And back into VNAV path again. Just waiting until we come below 150. We can take flaps 30. There's 150. And flaps 30 coming back now towards the approach, which we said was 112. We'll hold the approach. You can see there the terrain display as well working quite nicely. Just finishing up our before landing checks then, flaps. Our check and set, power management. Come back through to takeoff power. TLU is set to low speed. Icing conditions. No need to fly icing speeds. External lights are set, and that's the before landing checks complete. So visual with the runway, just coming on to speed. We'll take the autopilot out and yaw damper off.
United 863, you have 8 miles to run. Contact the tower 120.5.
120.5 and
Coming through 700 feet, so another 300 will be through the MDA. And showing 4 whites on the PAPI currently, so a little bit high, reducing the power. Just increasing that rate of descent. Again, pretty short runway here at Gisborne, so we'll aim to get ourselves in the touchdown zone and straight into full reverse.
500.
It's checked 500.
Minimum.
Okay, continuing. Still a little bit high. Should come back onto the PAPIs momentarily.
200. 100.
A little bit of a stutter there from the sim.
30. 20.
Okay, we need to put the aircraft onto the runway here. And full reverse, coming onto the brakes pretty quickly there. Again, short runway. We'll just let the props do the work for now, off the brakes. We'll try and keep the brake temps down for a fairly short turnaround. And again, having to almost force the aircraft nose wheel back down again. The nose really wanting to stay up. Anyway, just rolling through to the end. As I say, we'll backtrack the runway and vacate off to the left. So backtracking runway 32, just vacating off to the left, we'll get the aircraft slowed down for the turn. Just wait until we're clear of the runway and then we can run through our afterland checks. Nice short taxi in towards the terminal, as you can see. Okay, so clear of the runway. Hang lights can come off, same for the strobes. Flaps can come up. We'll engage the gas lock. Engine start selector can go off. Comm radios are set, transponder can go through to standby once again. And we'll just get the weather radar off here as well. According to the checklist I'm using, we could do a single engine taxi in towards the bay here, but that's going to complicate things somewhat, so we'll leave both engines running. Slightly busy here on the apron, so we'll keep a good lookout here as we taxi, get ourselves nice and slow. And we'll get the taxi light off as well. Looks like stand 2's free right next to the terminal, so we'll take that. And onto the brakes. Park brake is set, running through the parking and shutdown checks. Just action the afterland checklist first. So radars are standby, flight controls are locked, flaps are up, trims. I believe we want to reset the elevator trim to 1 unit up. And we can reset the aileron trim there as well. So trims are set. Landing strobe lights are off, anti-ice is off, probes. And windshield heating is off. TRU is off. And at least 2 minutes at idle power, we can shut down the number one. We've already discussed that, we'll just shut them both down now. So again, for the parking shutdown, park brake is set. We'll shut down the number one first. And good shutdown there on the number one. Again, we're going to be using hotel mode here whilst we deboard the plane. We're on the ground in Gisborne, so we'll come back to the feather detent on the number two. We'll leave that running. Cancelling the master caution. And we can engage the prop brake once again. And the prop brake is now engaged. Just taking a look there at our MP. You can see we are showing 0. So once again, the number 2 engine running there, acting as our APU here as we deboard the passengers. Speaking of which, passenger signs can go off. And that's the shutdown checklist complete. So an enjoyable flight out there in the ATR, a little bit of a mixed bag. As usual, we'll just finish up the video here. We'll take a few minutes to discuss the product and what I think of the Asobo ATR series. So there you go guys, I do hope you enjoyed our outing in the Asobo Hartmann ATR. Once again, a little bit of a mixed bag for me overall. Of course the aircraft is very well priced. Once again, Asobo have marketed the ATR as an expert series aircraft, and as we discussed during the flight, I think that's quite a generous term overall. Broadly, in terms of fidelity, I think it's fair to say the aircraft is roughly on a par with the likes of the CRJ, perhaps the fly-by-wire A320 as well, another good example of roughly where the ATR's fidelity lies. The product certainly does some things well, but as usual it does have its weaknesses. We'll discuss those starting with the weaknesses and we'll work our way through to what I like about the ATR. So firstly, again in terms of the aircraft being an expert aircraft, I don't think that moniker actually applies. As with the term study level, there is of course no dictionary definition, but I think expert series certainly conjures up images of something like the Phoenix Airbus A320 or the PMDG 737. Again, for me the ATR is more on a par with the CRJ or the fly-by-wire A320. Particularly, it's very similar in as much as there is some systems depth there. The aircraft does do certain things very well, but there are also quite a few bugs, quite a few strange issues with the product. One of the big and noticeable issues for me was the MCDUs. We've discussed those a bit during the flight. Firstly, the aircraft didn't seem to like entering airways. For me, that locked up the MCDUs to the point where I actually had to restart the flight in order to regain functionality of the aircraft. So there's definitely quite a few gremlins in the works there, a few things that need ironing out, and as ever it would have been nice to have seen those ironed out before release. I was quite surprised at generally how well the automation worked. Certainly the autopilot for the most part did a good job. I did have a few peculiar situations along the way. And the same goes with the general systems depth. Not bad overall, but there were one or two things I would question, a few things that seemed a little bit off. In terms of graphical fidelity, externally I thought the ATR looked really nice. Internally, the modelling very good. The texturing I wasn't quite so sure about. The panel colouring looks to be a little bit off to me, and the screens as well, a little bit dim, also quite hard to read. As compared with the CRJ, which I actually think is a really nice looking add-on within the sim, I do feel that the ATR looks a little bit dated. Sound-wise as well, a little bit of a mixed bag there. I don't know quite how accurate the sounds are internally, but certainly from a turboprop I was expecting a lot more noise. In the video here today we had the sounds cranked all the way up. Usually I have to tone them down quite a bit during editing. The rest of the soundscape is generally decent. For example, you do get master cautions, master warnings, rad-out callouts, things of that nature. I gather there are some inaccuracies there as well, but I don't think anything that's going to put the average user off. Lastly, just touching on the negatives of the flight model. Again, the aircraft has this tendency to auto-rotate during the takeoff. I do find that interesting. Again, the CRJ had the same behaviour, made by the same developer. Certainly that behaviour wasn't correct on the CRJ, and I suspect the same is true here with the ATR. One last negative point again is the lack of documentation. Whilst that might be excusable to some degree with some of Asobo's previous releases, certainly with an aircraft like this you are going to want some documentation, although in Asobo's defence they have produced a video series. The series was actually created by a real-world ATR pilot. There's some great info in there, so I'll leave a link to that down in the video description below. Touching on the FPS before we move on to my positives, arguably the FPS here could end up in the negative section. The ATR is pretty FPS intensive. I was getting around 39 FPS in the aircraft versus around 86 in the default Cessna 152. Of course there is a lot of glass real estate within the cockpit, and these sorts of figures will vary depending on your system configuration as well as your hardware options. But nevertheless, a 47 FPS loss is a pretty hefty hit. So moving on to what I like about the product, I do think some people have been slightly overly critical of the Asobo ATR. Once more, we are looking at a fairly cheap offering here, and an aircraft which I think does quite a lot right for the price. And it's clear, I think, despite the nomenclature, that the product isn't really intended for those of us who do enjoy our study level aircraft. It's really more of a mid-range, intermediate product. With that in mind then, overall I think the system's depth is pretty good. There are certainly some issues, mainly around the FMS as we've discussed already. Systems depth was such that I could pretty much run through the entire checklist, everything was clickable and seemed to have an associated function, associated modelling going on behind the scenes. So for me, whilst I'm sure there were some inaccuracies, I was quite happy in terms of systems depth. The same goes with the automation. Whilst I did have one or two peculiar events occur as a result of the automation on board the aircraft, generally speaking it did a pretty good job. It does still feel like a jazzed up default aircraft in terms of the automation. There are still some strange behaviours. but I found there to be enough fidelity to get the aircraft quite happily from A to B. Certainly as well if you want to take the aircraft on the likes of VATSIM, you should be okay there. Externally, I thought the aircraft looked pretty nice. Internally, by no means bad. Again, there were some nice areas of the cockpit, but I do feel it doesn't quite hold up as well as we've seen with other aircraft coming in recently. And lastly, once again touching on the flight model, I don't really know where to pin that. It's probably more of a neutral category overall. The aircraft was pleasant to fly, pretty enjoyable, didn't really have any vices other than that auto rotation during the takeoff. The ATR was also very stable once trimmed, easy to keep on the flight director bars. I will say though that it didn't really feel like I was flying a medium-sized aircraft. The control response was pretty snappy. And really, I think the most succinct way I can describe it, it felt as though I was flying a piece of computer programming as opposed to an actual aircraft. It was very much point and click in terms of its flight characteristics. So if you are looking to fly the aircraft for the sake of enjoyment, and of course there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing so, then I think you'll be very happy with the ATR overall. If, however, you are looking for a more accurate, full fidelity flight model, then personally to me it didn't come across as though the product offers that. In summary, I did enjoy my flight in the Asobo ATR, and I can see myself flying the aircraft again. With a few rounds of bug fixing, and hopefully as well some updates to, for example, the soundscape, maybe some of the internal texturing, I think the Asobo ATR has the foundations of a very solid, very enjoyable product, really ideally suited to those intermediate simmers amongst you. For the sort of money that I paid for the ATR, certainly I am happy with the product, and I suspect many of you would be also, again just so long as you aren't looking for a die-hard study level experience. To me it does seem as though there's enough of a split here between the Asobo ATR and the possible Blackbird Simulations ATR, so I do really hope that Blackbird continue with the development of their product. I really enjoyed our spot of regional turboprop flying within the sim, so it would be nice to have some more high fidelity options available. Anyway, that just about concludes for today's video. A little bit of a marathon for you, so thank you very much if you made it towards the end. If you enjoyed what you saw, then please consider giving the video a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. As always, a huge thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. We've got a few new joiners recently, as well as a couple of members and patrons approaching the 3-year mark, so again, a very big thank you. I do hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.